Hey guys, and welcome back. This is our Constitutional Era SOL 5 lecture. All right, so let's look at the original Constitutional Convention. Our first attempt at government is not going to go great. We're going to make an intentionally weak government under something called the Articles of Confederation. So the Articles of Confederation are our first attempt at government before the Constitution. So we're defining a new form of government, and we want to protect our individual rights, and it's a trial and error process. All right, let's take a look. So we were afraid of a powerful central government like Britain's. We just fought a war to give King George the boot, and we don't want to create a new king. So what do? We make a very weak government under the Articles of Confederation and adopt it at the end of the war. But guess what, guys? It's too weak. So we're going to have to get rid of it and replace it with one that's a little bit stronger. Let's take a look. Weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Let's look at some reasons why the Articles were too weak. So like I said, it was a weak national government. There was no executive branch. That means there was no president. All right, there was no judicial branch, no Supreme Court, no federal courts. There was just a legislative branch, all right, and each state only had one vote, and they couldn't do anything without approval of the states. So essentially, this is a national government that can't do anything. It has no power at all, all right? And I know what you're thinking. You're like, well, so what? Why can't the states just govern themselves? In order for us to trade, to defend ourselves, to act in times of crisis, we have to be able to act as a nation. In our modern society, states have rights. The national government and the Constitution are supreme, but we have leeway to govern ourselves. All right? But under the Articles, we were just sovereign states. We had no nation. We need a nation. All right. The Articles of Confederation gave the government no power to tax or regulate interstate trade. So this means no power to tax means no military, no public works. Interstate commerce is trade between the states. You have to have a neutral third party, a referee, if you will, to regulate trade. Otherwise, you won't be able to do it. All right, more on that later. There's no common currency, no US dollar. So it was hard to do business with each other. And all states had one vote regardless of size. All right, so we created this very weak government, and then we had Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shays was a farmer who fought in the Revolution. He fought at Bunker Hill. He fought at Saratoga. Guess what? Under the Articles of Confederation, the government couldn't tax. They couldn't pay him, right? So guess what? Because he couldn't get paid, they took his farm away from him. Not only did they take his farm, they were going to throw him in debtor's prison, right? So imagine he's off fighting for the country. He doesn't get paid. And not only does he not get paid, they're like, hey, you haven't been paying your rent, so we're going to take your farm. All right? Shays is mad, and he's not alone. This happened to many, many, many farmers. So Shays leads a rebellion. He goes and he takes all of his fellow farmers. They march to the courts. And they say, because the courts, basically the judges are the ones who are declaring farms seized and sentencing people to debtor's prison. So they all go armed to the courts and they say the courts are closed today. And the judges, not wanting to, be killed by this angry mob of armed farmers, say, hey, you bet, the courts are closed. We're going home. Shays leads his army to the Massachusetts courts. Then he goes to Springfield, where the state arsenal is. And there's no U.S. government response because under the Articles of Confederation, there's really no U.S. government. It shows everybody that the Articles of Confederation are too weak. We need something a little bit stronger to be able to solve problems and act in times of crisis. All right. So like I said, the Articles of Confederation had no power to tax. So they were always short on money. They couldn't pay their troops. They couldn't regulate trade. They had no power to enforce laws. All right. There's no executive or judicial branch, no national court system. So if a quarrel broke out between the states, it was difficult to resolve, so we couldn't trade. We had to depend on the states to do everything. We couldn't enact new laws. So this government is not going to work. We're going to have to replace it with something better. We're going to replace it with the Constitution. So let's look at some problems and some solutions. One problem caused by the Articles of Confederation: no Bill of Rights, right? And no military power. So the Constitution is going to have a Bill of Rights. It's going to establish justice, and it's going to have the ability to raise a military that can ensure domestic tranquility. All right, British troops were in the American territories. We had an economic depression, and we had problems trading between the states. Remember that under the Articles, the government couldn't regulate interstate commerce. It couldn't regulate trade between the states. Under the Constitution, it will provide a military that will provide for the common defense and will act to regulate trade and promote the general welfare. Let's look at some key leaders at the Constitutional Convention. This is George Washington. You guys probably recognize George Washington, right? He's president of the Constitutional Convention. He was there because of his prestige, his celebrity status. He's a household name. When people hear about this Constitutional Convention, they're like, oh, George Washington's there, so it must be legitimate. All right, he didn't really do a whole lot. He didn't really participate in the debates. He kept quiet. He was there for his celebrity status. James Madison, however, did participate a lot. He's nicknamed the father of the Constitution. He's a Virginian and political philosopher. He led the debate. He kept detailed notes. He authored the Virginia Plan and much of the Bill of Rights. All right, let's look at some key issues during the convention. All right, look at this political cartoon. See, it's got Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, Massachusetts. It says federal superstructure, as in the superstructure of the national government. And the artist is saying, what is the artist saying? If we're not together, if we're not all on board, if we don't all support this national government, then it's going to collapse. So we all have to support it. The new states need to work together. All right, one issue that we're going to run into is state versus federal power. We have a federal system of government. In a federal system of government, you have a national government, and then you have power delegated to state governments. All right, federal law is supreme law of the land. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and states have leeway to govern themselves. So like when I was a kid, when I was 16, 17 years old, I had leeway to govern myself. I was allowed to go out, but like on the weekend, I had to be back by curfew. If I wasn't back by curfew, my parents would take away my car keys. So my parents were like the Constitution. I was like a state government. I had leeway to govern myself as long as I didn't go against my parents' rules. Some folks are going to try to defy the Constitution, right? Remember, well, we're going to talk about this later. The Confederates are going to try to secede to preserve slavery. They want to keep slaves. They think Lincoln is going to get rid of slavery, so they secede. And we send the U.S. Army down, and we assert the power of the Constitution, and the Constitution and the United States win, right? The Civil War is going to be fought over slavery, and it's going to be a test of the Constitution. All right. We've got a conflict of small versus large states. Some states are very small, and they have small populations, and then we have large states, as in states with large populations. Under the New Jersey plan by William Patterson wanted every state to get the same number of votes regardless of size. He represents New Jersey. New Jersey has a small population. He's concerned that New Jersey won't get very much say under the new Constitution. Opposing this is the Virginia plan, which says that we should have 3 branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. And it also says that that representation in the national legislature should be based on population. All right. So we have a conflict. We have the Virginia plan that says base it on population, and the New Jersey plan that says give every state one vote. So Roger Sherman in the Great Compromise combines the two plans. The New Jersey plan creates the Senate. In the Senate, every state gets 2 votes. The Virginia plan creates the House of Representatives. In the House of Representatives, you have 435 people. And each state gets a number of representatives based on its population. So imagine this is like a big pie. And depending on how many people you have, the more people in your state, the bigger piece of the pie you get. So in the Senate, everybody gets 2. In the House, you get a share of the votes based on your population. These 2 houses make up our bicameral, our modern 2-house legislature, which is called Congress. Okay, so it balances power between large and small states, creating the Senate, where each state gets 2 senators, and the House of Representatives, where membership is based on population. All right, another issue, the issue that is going to divide our nation and lead to civil war eventually, is slavery. Southern delegates want to count their slaves in determining representation in the House of Representatives. Remember, I told you, the number of votes you get in the House of Representatives is based on your population. Look at Virginia. Virginia has almost 300,000 enslaved people in 1790. So they want to count all those people in terms of getting their votes in the House. Northern delegates say you can't do that because they're not citizens. So they compromise, and this is a very kind of cold approach to humanity. It's called the 3/5 compromise, where each slave is counted as 3/5 of a person in terms of representation in the House of Representatives. On a side note, as we get into the 1800s, slavery in Virginia and Maryland will start to decline as they turn to food crops, and we'll see an increase in slavery in the Deep South as they turn to cotton. But Virginia, throughout the duration of the institution of slavery, will always have more enslaved people within its borders than any other state. The number of enslaved people in Virginia is always higher throughout the entire institution of slavery. All right, so to limit the power of the federal government, we create 3 co-equal branches of government. All right, that is the legislative branch, which is Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. The executive branch, which is the president, vice president, and his cabinet, and the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court and the federal court system. These 3 branches of government limit government power by checking each other. It's called checks and balances. For example, the executive branch appoints Supreme Court justices. Those Supreme Court justices are confirmed by Congress. All right? The judicial branch can rule executive actions unconstitutional and laws made by the legislative branch unconstitutional. Right? So these are just a couple of examples, but they all have power over each other. And the point of this is no one person or group of people can hold all the power. So that limits the power of the federal government to those identified in the Constitution. All right. So the end result is the Constitution, a government that allows for powers to be shared between national and state governments. It protects the rights of states and individuals. It allows for orderly change. We can change our Constitution by amending it. It's a living document, so it's always changing and adjusting. Our interpretation of it is always changing and adjusting as our society evolves. And it becomes a blueprint for self-government that other countries will emulate. Let's look at some documents that influence the Constitution. One of them is the Virginia Declaration of Rights, written by George Mason. George Mason writes the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which established basic human rights that can't be violated by governments. Sounds familiar. He's got some inspiration from Locke there. This becomes used as a model for the Bill of Rights that's written by James Madison. The Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom is written by Thomas Jefferson. It outlaws a state-established church. So, like, for example, Virginia cannot say the official church of Virginia is Southern Baptist. It's not allowed. The government cannot favor one particular religion. Okay? Madison is going to draw from this document when he's creating the Bill of Rights. There's a non-establishment clause in the First Amendment that ensures that the government can't favor one particular church. You have freedom of religion in the United States. The government can't favor a particular church. Let's look at Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. So these are two groups that emerge during the constitutional era. Federalists are very pro-Constitution. They are in favor of a strong national government, where Anti-Federalists have some concerns. They're very worried about a new king. They want a weak national government and states' rights. They will be satisfied by the creation of a Bill of Rights that protects individual liberty. All right, Federalists like a strong central government. Anti-Federalists fear a strong central government because they believe it would be a danger to their freedom. They favor states' rights. Federalists promote economic and public improvements. They see the government as a tool for promoting the economy and for public improvements, whereas, like I said, Anti-Federalists prefer less government involvement in the economy. Today, those who want the federal government to solve national problems trace their backgrounds to Federalists. So a person who is more likely to call themselves a Democrat or liberal today believes things similar to the Federalists, whereas a person who tends to be more conservative or Republican today is more like the Anti-Federalists. Anti-Federalists want liberty, individual rights, and free markets. Okay. And you can see Ronald Reagan is an example of a modern-day conservative who would have been like, you know, an Anti-Federalist, and President Obama is like is a modern Democrat who's more like the Federalists. Okay, all right. Prominent Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. So prominent Federalists are George Washington and James Madison, whereas prominent Anti-Federalists, leaders of the Anti-Federalists, were Patrick Henry and George Mason. So we still see elements of Federalist and Anti-Federalist beliefs today. People believe all sorts of different things. People argue about the size and role of government. How much involvement should we have? How involved should the government be in the economy? How involved should the government be in states' issues? Some people say the government should be more involved with the economy. Some people say the government should be less involved with the economy. You could be economically liberal, but socially conservative. You could be socially liberal, but economically conservative. And I know that's a little confusing. There's not really a right or wrong here. It's just your beliefs, your values. Do you think there should be more government involvement? The government should step in and get more involved in the economy and solve problems? Or do you think the government will cause more problems than it solves and it should just be less involved? And most of us are somewhere in the middle. And this is just, there's always going to be this push and pull between liberalism and conservatism, because that's sort of the nature of our society. And like I said, it's not a right or wrong thing, it's a values thing. It's what you believe. And so you just kind of have to look at the issue, think about it in terms of what you value and what you believe, and then you know, make a decision based on your value system. All right. Let's look at these. These are three Marshall Court cases. These are John Marshall, Chief Justice John Marshall, he's Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He's a Virginian. And there are three cases under his tenure that expand and strengthen the power of the judicial branch significantly. Let's look at those three cases. And I'm going to kind of break them down in sort of plain terms. Marbury versus Madison is a Supreme Court case under Chief Justice John Marshall that establishes the very important precedent of judicial review. This means that the courts, the judicial branch, the federal courts, can review laws and actions of the legislative and executive branch and determine their constitutionality. This means that, let's say, a state makes a law or Congress makes a law. All right, I'll give you an example. Virginia had a law that said that black people and white people cannot get married. They were called anti-miscegenation laws. It was illegal for black people and white people to get married. All right, and there was a couple. They lived over in Caroline County, Richard and Mildred Loving. All right, they got married. They were living in Caroline County. They were arrested and charged with violating that law. Their case went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court looked at that law and said it's unconstitutional. It violated their 14th Amendment right to equal protection under the law. And so the Supreme Court ruled that law unconstitutional, and unconstitutional means illegal. So that law went away in Virginia in 1967. In 1967, it was illegal for black people and white people to marry, but that law was ruled unconstitutional. But that's not that long ago, guys. But anyway, by invalidating that law in Virginia, the Supreme Court also invalidated that law nationally. So all the southern states had that same law. All the old Confederate states had that same law that black people and white people could not get married. But by that one instance of judicial review, those laws were wiped out nationwide. So judicial review is the power of the Supreme Court to look at things Congress does, to look at things the president does, to look at the things the state does, and determine if they are in line with the Constitution. A very important power that they have. Another important power of the Supreme Court and of the federal government is the doctrine of implied power. So if you imply something, you don't necessarily say it explicitly. And the example that I always use is, let's say that I handed you a piece of paper and I told you to take it to the office. Would you then walk out of my classroom, go to the office, open the office door, set the piece of paper on the ground, and then walk away? No, of course not. You would go down there, you would walk up to the person behind the desk, you would say, hey, Mr. Pierce told me to bring this to the office, and then you would come back. I didn't tell you to do all that. I just said, take this to the office. It was implied. I implied that I wanted you to do that other stuff. According to McCulloch versus Maryland, the Constitution works the same way. It says some things and implies some others. So an example of this would be the draft. So the draft is when you can be forced into the military during a time of war. The Constitution doesn't say that you can be drafted. The Constitution says the federal government has the power to raise an army. The draft is an implied power. It's implied that they can draft you into that army. Okay? This is also known as the elastic clause because the Constitution is stretchy. It implies some things. You can stretch it a little bit and read between the lines. Now, here's the trick. How stretchy is it? All right? Is it really stretchy? Are there lots of implied powers? Or is it only a little elastic? Is it only a little stretchy? Are there few implied powers? That depends on you. If you're a strict constructionist, if you have a strict interpretation of the Constitution, you are conservative. All right? So you don't think the Constitution has very many implied powers. If you are a loose constructionist of the Constitution, you have a loose interpretation of the Constitution, and you think the Constitution has more implied powers. There's not a right or wrong here, guys. It's a values thing. It's a beliefs thing. It's up to you. You have to decide. And sometimes on some issues, you might think it's strict, and sometimes you might think it's loose, and that's okay. Right? It's okay to think in liberal terms one moment and in conservative terms the next. Right? This is the ongoing debate in our society. And will continue to be. That's the nature of our government. All right, no right or wrong. It's a values thing. It's a beliefs thing. All right, Gibbons versus Ogden finally gives the government a broad view of economic power. All right, the analogy that I use for this case is a football game. So imagine it's a Friday night. We're getting ready to play a football game. You got the Middlesex players on the field. You got the West Point players on the field, right? And we're going to play the game. But here's the thing. There's no referee. We're not going to have a referee for this football game. If a call needs to be made, we're going to let the players figure it out. Maybe we'll let the coaches get involved. How's that going to go down, guys? Are the coaches of the opposite teams and the players going to agree that somebody's offsides or there was pass interference or something like that? It's just going to be a fight. What's going to be the result? We're not going to be able to play the game. But we really want to play the game, right? So we need the referee. Our economy works the same way. The states are like the players. The leaders of the states are like the coaches. And the game is trade. The game is business. If we want to trade and we want to do business with each other, we need a ref. So our national government is like the referee for our economy. Now, we don't always like the referee, do we? Sometimes we don't agree with the referee. Sometimes they make calls that are bad calls. Sometimes they make calls that aren't in our favor, but we need the referee to play the game. And so Gibbons versus Ogden establishes the national government as the referee over the economy, giving it a broad view of economic power. All right. These three cases are the foundation blocks of our court's authority to mediate disagreements between branches of government. Branches of government, again, are legislative, executive, and judicial. It also gives the government power to mediate disagreements between levels of government. Levels of government are state and national. So you got state governments, and then you have the national government, the federal government. And it gives the government the power to mediate disagreements between competing business interests, states, between states and other countries, etc. This concludes our SOL 5 Constitutional Era lecture. Make sure you guys do the discussion board. Make sure you guys read the narrative and answer the questions. And make sure that you fill out the guided notes. See you guys next time.